increasingly concerned with the evolution of the American research university and American higher education in general, that's what I study, and the American professoriate. Given the recent rise in our desire as an institution to be much more corporate-like, the faculty as a very historically monastic and vocational profession now finds itself really in an exacerbated tension with those principles. And I felt it was time to really take a good look and see how we got this way and what we think about it and why it makes sense, why it doesn't make sense, and frankly, what its effects are. In particular, its effects on teaching, on ideas around collegiality, and on how it is that faculty deal with accountability. I became interested in Dewey and American pragmatism when I first began doctoral studies, and I was thinking about the intellectual history that guides American higher education. And I was drawn to that largely, I think, because it was a way to understand what it means to be American. Being someone who is an immigrant to this country and who thinks in a very bilingual, bicultural way, I often had to think about, well, what's the cultural context here? And American higher education has a very peculiar American set of sensibilities around autonomy, around individuality, around ways in which that we allow authority and don't allow authority. And all of that, given how I think about American higher education, makes sense to me to think pragmatically. Pragmatism reconciled a lot of those tensions, that you could have freedom, you could be autonomous, you could be an individual, and yet allow certain semblance of authority and restriction of my freedom and be part of a public. And that is a very, I think, very interesting American position. And I'm very attracted to it, both philosophically as well as culturally as well. No one ever thinks about Dewey as a higher education theorist, and he wouldn't either. I'm sure he's rolling in his grave up in Vermont right now, having just said that. But in fact, really, Dewey paid little attention to even K-12. I mean, really, it was really from the period of 1900 to about 1916 that he was sort of focused on it. But he saw education writ large as public policies, so he saw it as a politics. And higher education to him wasn't a focus of his interests. He was really a political philosopher. And as I come at it, it is very true that higher education scholars and higher education scholarship contains very little analysis in that vein. So I guess it is innovative. At its core, the corporate managerial university really has a discourse that is very much about production and empirical production and empirical verification, which, great, it makes sense. There are lots of ways in which we can actually account for the labor of the faculty in that way. But there are lots of things that it can't account for. So that logic system, it's very much an economy of exchange. In fact, this is sort of this discourse of the student as client or client services. That is an anathema to the vocational aspect of the faculty, because we're thinking about inquiry, which often can't be measured empirically, because in fact, what good liberal discovery does is free you from that. I may need to verify it and account for it in particular ways, but at its core, it's a freeing of the intellect. In particular, teaching is the square peg in that round accountability hole, the managerial university's accountability processes. Teaching is very, very much not an economy of exchange. It is very much, and I've written elsewhere about this, it's really an economy of gift giving in the philosophical sense, because there's no quid pro quo. And learning and establishing learning outcomes is the most difficult thing to empirically measure. So even though the teaching evaluations at the end of the semester may say that as an instructor, I always was organized and I had core principles clearly set up in the course and students knew what to expect, et cetera, all those items, right? It doesn't really tell me how or what and in what way students' learning was developed, enhanced, magnified, deepened by this particular course. That is very difficult for the managerial logic that grounds accountability practices to get. And one of the challenges that we have as instructors is, in fact, to figure out ways to assess and or measure learning, because we should be held accountable for that, without a doubt. Well, let's talk a little bit about what we could see as perhaps a virtue of standardization. In a way, we can say that, well, look, with regard to instruction, one of the ways in which we want to, quote, standardize is have core sets of principles around introductory courses in political science. And as a faculty, we have to sit and think about what those might be. Now, that's a positive standardization. The negative effects of, and then therefore we can say, oh, so someone who has an introductory course in poli-sci at BC has access to these learning objectives, and this is the kind of content that he or she will be able to access. Great. The negative ramifications is that, in fact, standardizing instruction, we now know, tends to lead to the types of pedagogical approaches that are not learning effective. They're not educative because they don't require critical thinking. So we tend to narrow the scope of instruction. Oftentimes, what students will tell you it looks like is just very classic, straight lecture. I'm covering the material. This is what you're responsible for. I may use technology a little bit, but not in the way that broadens the scope of that instruction. So we narrow the range of instruction. Another ramification is because I'm being measured against certain standards, I may limit the type of instruction that leads to certain outcomes, because those outcomes aren't important in all of these measures that I am being held accountable for. So if in my promotion and tenure, if in my merit review, these are the outcomes that matter, why would I pay attention to these? So now I'm going to narrow learning outcomes. I'm also going to lose sight of, or at least I'm prone to lose sight of, the fact that, and this has been the burr in the saddle of all teachers and all learners throughout time, that though we could say that there is some similarity across learners, it's more than a crapshoot. We have individual learners. We have very individual learning constructs. We have cultural constructs that drive that. We have cognitive facilities. We now know more about individual cognition than ever before. So to standardize means we may err on the side of hypergeneralization of how learning happens and what learning is and how I know it when I see it, as opposed to thinking about learning as an individual move that then requires me as an instructor to be conscious of the fact that how someone reads this text and does analysis critically can be different, substantially different from this other student, and yet they both get to the same point, and that is that they've critically just analyzed this text. There is no doubt, and the data will bear that out, that faculty in the last 20 years have and do produce more scholarship than ever before. We see that in the proliferation of academic journals, academic books. We see the ratcheting up of performance, merit, and promotion standards for faculty, so that as we take a look at generations of faculty, what it took to get tenure at institution X now versus 10 years ago is dramatically different. We see that across gender, despite the fact, for example, that women faculty now teach more than ever, they also now produce more than ever. So even when we take a look at the dimensions across faculty, generation, age, even institution type. For example, in the last 20 years, faculty at liberal arts colleges, historically the teaching institution, right, teaching-centered institution, have produced 4 times over the amount that they used to. Well, we know that the reason for that is largely driven by the desire for institutions to place themselves strategically in a market. And that market is the competitive market for students. And the competitive market for students in a free economy is helped along, influenced by things like rankings. It's very pernicious because all of those moves also engender other series of benefits for the institutions. The higher that my institution is ranked, the more likely I am to be able to garner external funds. Well, the more external funds I get, the better my institution looks in the rankings. So it becomes a very pernicious type of situation, so that faculty are pushed more and more to produce more and more. Great, I guess. I mean, you're the librarian. One could probably, after a few drinks, realize that maybe some of the scholarship that we've produced probably shouldn't have been produced. But the more important thing is that time is finite, and good research and good scholarship requires time. And yet, as Dewey said in the early years of the 20th century, the American faculty are special custodians of American higher education and knowledge production, and with that comes special responsibilities, which means, and meant for him, the teaching of students. We were certainly, it was important for us as a profession to think about ourselves as reproducing knowledge through students, and also to producing new knowledge. And the more that we produce new knowledge, the less we think about, well, how are we transmitting that knowledge? And in Dewey's era, that was the beginning of that tension. So in effect, we don't have the time, or as much time as it really demands. And teaching, in the years that I've been teaching, since the early 90s, is very labor intensive. There's no getting around it, especially if you don't standardize your instruction. So it's a real, professionally, it's a real issue for us. I think that Derek Bok's claims are legitimate. I think it's very interesting coming from a former president of Harvard, you know, the sort of mothership of corporate universities. But in fact, he recognized that something has to be put in place to balance out the push for more research, more scholarship, and the push to really stay in touch and also stay true to the special custodial responsibility that faculty have. And in the course of a day, you know, there are 24 hours, we have X number of students, et cetera, et cetera. And younger faculty feel this more because younger faculty feel the demand of production for tenure. I wish it would stop there because actually we find that production is much higher, at higher rates after tenure, so it doesn't stop. So there's trouble, Yes, and there's a lot of irony in it, as all good pragmatism has. And the irony being that the university, whether public or private in the United States, has historically, since the turn of the 20th century, and really after the Civil War, but it really didn't kick in until the 20th century, had a decidedly public mission. The public institutions clearly. There is the contract with the state. We think about, for example, the University of Massachusetts. It's a clear-cut contract with the state to produce students and also research for the good of the state. Private institutions have also that implicit contract that we educate, we research, we study for the public good. And it's a public democratic good. So it can be said, for example, that science, and this is I think what is most, I think, unique about American higher education. It's the recognition that, for example, in the sciences, and we make the same argument in the humanities, in the sciences that basic science research is at core liberally democratic. Because we're going to, as a society, say, go out and inquire, discover. We're going to take our chances. You're going to have some bad moments, and we can think about Tuskegee as an example. But for the most part, we're going to gamble on the fact that the opening up or the freeing of the scientific mind is going to yield knowledge for the democratic good. And in the sciences, we can point to all the ways in which scientific discovery for healthcare is the perfect example right now, has led to better quality of life. In the social sciences, we see that with policy, we see it with engineering. We see clearly that actually the great democratic gamble with the universities has paid off very, very well. So in reality, it is a desire to have higher education as a public good, which means that the faculty has to engage in the work of the mind liberally, but also the special custodial responsibility. That's a lot. We're a social institution. We have a lot of responsibility. It's also very true that it's also a public good in the sense that we think about it as a place where all of the citizens, and I use that word very generically, have access to that. So we're always thinking about ways in which higher education, because we're doing this great work, has to be open to its citizenry. So that as we think about the democratic public good, it is a very broad conception of the public good. It may mean the 2-year technical institute, and it may mean the PhD in nuclear physics. It may mean the teachers' college that prepares folks to do elementary education, and it may well be that student who then also goes on to be a superintendent of schools to take care of a school district. All of those things. And that's very unique in the world, and we do that without being centralized. We don't have a national university. We're not beholden to the federal government for lots of things. So we as social institutions are left to do to engage in democratic imperatives. And we are believed to be able to self-regulate enough to be able to do that and are trusted enough. The public has to trust us, and that's the irony, that in fact we want to do the public's good, and the public has either been led to believe or has been told, or we don't inform the public well. I think it's all of that, that higher education is, I don't know, that we're all fat cats, I guess, that the expense of higher education, whether in public or the private sector, is so exorbitant, and it's just wasteful, that they're not getting a good return on their investment. And I think that probably is largely the big issue right now with our desire to be custodians of the public good and the public not really understanding what it is that we do. You know, I think any book, you get through certain parts of the book and you think, oh, that would be really good to go that way, and then you're reminded about your prospectus and you have to stay in line. So there are a couple of things that have come out. Right now I'm doing work on trying to figure out how the norms of managerialism have changed or have impacted women faculty in particular, because it's a very gendered discourse, and that's a project that I'm doing now. It's very interesting, and it's right now at the conceptual stage, and then there's an empirical piece that's coming up next year. And another thing that I would have liked to have done is, I think that I'm just very, I'm seduced by the era, the transformative era, that 1870 to 1944, because it really does frame a lot of current discourse around the role of government and its agencies, like education, for the public good. And I wanted to do a little bit more around curriculum and how it is that the disciplines made certain decisions around curriculum, especially after the 1930s and into the 1940s, that set up what we now know as the great universities. And so that's still out there. That's perhaps another sabbatical. But anyway, so those are the two big ones.